not trying to be well, you look like you were heading. I didn't know if that, but I just.
Well, good morning. My name is Teresa. I am a upper school history and literature teacher at Converse, Arizona, and I'm excited to be here with all of you. When Melanie first asked me to talk about teaching history and literature classically, I had a bit of a panic attack. This is a huge topic, and narrowing it down seemed impossible. So I spent the summer talking to a lot of my teacher friends and trying to figure out how do we define the boundaries of teaching history and literature classically. And that completely backfired on me. Instead, everyone I talked to had more and bigger ideas that didn't narrow anything down, but instead blew my boundaries far out of sight. And in hindsight, I should have expected that. Because at its core, that's what classical education is about. It's about expanding our horizons, about throwing out our boundaries to see beyond our own narrow vision, to see beyond ourselves. Now, I have a background in classical education. I literally don't know anything else. I was taught that way in elementary, high school, college, and grad school. And I have been teaching for 10 years in classical schools. So I can't tell you what the opposite or what non-classical education is, but I can start by sharing with you what I've found to be the common thread in all my teacher friends that I've spoken to and my own experience. And that is the end goal of classical education. We have to start here, as strange as it seems. We have to keep this in mind because classical education, classical teaching, is firmly rooted in the dust and dreams of ancient Rome and Greece. And it has for its purpose the goal of making us free. Mr. Terry spoke about that this morning wonderfully, that we want our students to be free from their own fears, their own anger, their own misunderstanding, free from being manipulated by news agencies, free so that they can choose wisely to make good decisions. That has to be our starting point as classical teachers. And this is huge, it's difficult, because this journey towards freedom is never ending. As long as we live, we are engaged in this pilgrimage towards freedom. It's an odyssey. And it's one which children recognize intrinsically. It's generally only we as adults who think we've already arrived or try to live like we've already arrived. Children know that we haven't. And we have to be honest with them about the fact that we're on this journey, that our goal is freedom. Because if we try to pass off something lesser as that end, if we try to tell them that it's the grades or the star whatever or the skills that are our end goal, they will smell BS and we will lose them. So we have to start there. But just as they recognize BS, children also recognize truth much faster than adults do. And when we put in front of them truths about the human nature, about art, about our struggles to be human and to live well and to reach for that freedom, they do recognize that as well. And as with all human beings, the more we expose them to certain ideas, the more they begin to take their observations and orient themselves, direct themselves by those truths that they see. So the liberal arts, so-called because they are meant to make us free, they're not the end goals in themselves. They are the signposts that help us direct our journeys, help us make decisions, evaluate what we're living for. History and literature are a huge part of this. Now, there are other liberal arts, science, math, logic. Those are part of this, but they're much more quantifiable. History, literature, and humanities are much harder to pin down and even harder to grade. We have to find that mixture of objective and subjective that just seems to be out of reach. But what history and literature offer, in particular to them, is that they offer the chance to discuss and think and ask questions about how are we living, how are we approaching life. They offer us signposts and inspiration so that we might avoid similar pitfalls or reach echoing heights. History. History helps us have a framework for understanding the great struggles, the terrible works of humankind. It helps us understand who we are here and now. We've inherited the cultures of our ancestors. What will we do with that? How did they change? And how can we add to those cultures? Understanding our roots helps us build and make decisions for our future. History is the grappling ground of ideas where we can see what has worked or not. Literature takes those premises and strips them back so they no longer have the peripheral concerns of real life human beings. Literature makes the point of the entire artwork very clear towards what makes us human. C.S. Lewis said, "Literary experience heals the wound without undermining the privilege of individuality." In reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself. Like a night sky in the Greek poem, I see with a myriad of eyes, but it is still I who see. Here I transcend myself and am never more myself than what I do. Literature is not just a signpost, it is also the touchstone, which helps us to ground our humanity and reach for greatness. So teaching history and literature has to start with that end in mind. We're not checking off lists of skills, although we have a few that might come in handy. We're not charting pages read. But what we are doing, what we are looking for, is the signs that our students can recognize greatness and failure, and that they learn to reach for the highest goal. That they have well-ordered passions and free souls. Now, 20th century philosopher G.K. Chesterton was very interested in this journey, in the nature of signs and where we're aiming for, what should be our end goal. And I have a passage on your tables from him, from his introduction to orthodoxy. We're going to read this and discuss this, and I will call on a few of you for answers. So if you weren't prepared, start getting prepared. Would someone like to volunteer to read it out loud? Yes, please.
So Signposts in Strangeland, 1, The End Goal. Intro to Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton. I have often had a fancy for writing a romance about an English yachtsman who slightly miscalculated his course and discovered England under the impression that it was a new island in the South Seas. There will probably be a general impression that the man who landed, armed to the teeth and talking by signs, to plant the British flag on the barbaric temple, which turned out to be the pavilion in Brighton, felt rather a fool. I am not here concerned to deny that he looked a fool, but if you imagine that he felt a fool, or at any rate that the sense of folly was his soul or his dominant emotion, then you have not studied with sufficient delicacy the rich romantic nature of the hero of this tale. His mistake was really a most inviolable mistake, and he knew it, if he was the man I take him for. What could be more delightful than to have in the same few minutes all the fascinating terrors of going abroad combined with all the humane security of coming home again? What could be better than to have all the fun of discovering South Africa without the necessity of landing there? What could be more glorious than to brace oneself up to discover New South Wales and then realized with a gush of happy tears that it was really old Southlands. This at least seems to me the main problem for philosophers, and as in a manner the main problem of this book. How can we contrive to be at once astonished at the world and yet at home in it? How can this queer cosmic town, with its many-legged citizens, with its monstrous and ancient lamps, how can this world give us at once the fascination of a strange town and the comfort and honor of being our own town?
So Chesterton lays out the contradiction. How can we have astonishment and comfort of home at once? And that's the first question to discuss with your table. How do you answer this challenge? Take a moment, I'll give you about a minute. I will call on you.
The first thing that came to me was
they provide us with a chance to simultaneously live with characters who recognize the basic impulses, the desires, the things that they do are recognized as human, but within the context of a history story.
And open up that question to your role as an educator. How do you extend or open that challenge to your students?
Becomes a broader, bigger story of humanity. That's particularly true for both literatures. Telling a ancient myth, it's a world where monsters can exist with the most horrific things can happen, and the most beautiful things can happen simultaneously. And that's actually true of history as well. It's not necessarily monsters, you human beings in one place, but you enter into a world where you can tell your seniors, for example, these stories of ordinary Americans struggling through the Great Depression and having seen how terrible that is. But then also get them up to the story of Americans flying from out so that you get out. And then you can turn it into by describing the Holocaust and give them the primary sources and wrestling with how do human beings do this and recognize the fundamental humanity of both the victims and the perpetrators. It's not alien monsters. It was beings on the wheel.
you said that just to finish imagination, literature varies from imagination. It's kind of the same. You know what I mean? Like what he's saying is, it's you recognizing humanity.
3 seconds.
I've lived the lives of thousands of men, and yet I make myself. I see me in all.
All right. I heard a lot of good things while I was walking around the room. Would you share what you were saying earlier?
Well, we're nerd teachers. I have my kids close their eyes at like the punchline of the story and like feel the emotions of the character and like open their eyes. And I was saying a lot of times they like can express a lot for being 5 years old on like how they felt.
Yeah, there's a discovery in learning as we come to the end of a story or a history. It resonates with them no matter how young they are. And at this table back here, I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
My name?
In what?
Oh, it's Kate.
Yeah.
Okay.
What were you saying earlier?
I'm sorry, Peter.
What were you saying earlier?
The point I was making at this table, this comes from teaching with history and literature at the same time, is both disciplines give us an opportunity to work with our students in a way or with disciplines that challenge them because on the one hand, everything we cover, they can recognize in their own daily lives. If you're reading a story, even an ancient myth, they can recognize the basic human impulses. Someone wants money, someone wants the girl, someone wants to win the war, someone, so on and so forth. They recognize the basic human impulses. But in the context of the story, it can be anything. Anything can happen. The world becomes larger than just the little world of the classroom, the little world they live in at home, the little bubble of social friends. It becomes a vast, unknown alien landscape that they're invited into, and anything can happen. It's a world where monsters and horrible evils can exist. It's a world where wonderful beauty can exist simultaneously. How do you wrestle with that? And history is the same way. I can walk them through, for example, the Great Depression with primary sources, with photographs and the kind of nitty-gritty details. And in a way, they can learn to relate to it because many of them have lived through a context where their parents have been through economic difficulty. Then the question is getting them to realize how much greater this is. This is unlike anything you've encountered in terms of scale and scope. And then they get to work with the gradual triumph of ordinary Americans like them, overcoming these obstacles and thriving as a society in the decade following the Depression. And then, of course, you spin around in the gut by trying to deal with the ramifications of something like the Holocaust and working through how does a tragedy of this scale occur, and try to work towards the realization that this didn't come about because of monsters, but ordinary people, both perpetrators and victims, are people like you. How? Why? How can you use your imagination to enter into this world and see that these people are human beings like you?
Sorry, this is my voice. Dr. Moore.
So I had two thoughts here, and I'm not sure it's an interesting idea of being completely alien and at the same time being at home, and the fact that these yachts are all those three things I was thinking of. So my first thought was Petrarch, Renaissance humanist who some say discovered the Renaissance, and he's always talking to the ancients. So he does something really weird. He writes letters to Cicero and tells Cicero where he went wrong and where he went right. So he's almost more at home with the ancients than he is with his own contemporary pre-Renaissance Italian culture. So I think, if I understand Chesterton, this is part of what he's talking about. He's talking about going on a journey where you find something you think is one thing, but it's really another, trying to figure out how you feel home both. It's what we're after. I think studying history is the metaphor we're looking at. The fact of the matter is, I didn't grow up reading Petrarch. I grew up listening to Willie Nelson. And so if I can't relate it to where I'm home, it doesn't make any sense. And for Willie, home is not living alone. Home is on the road again. So I put this yachtsman here. I think he's an adventurer, right? And going to these places that seem weird at first and making yourself home there is what life is really about. Right? It's almost an invitation. And like this yachtsman, you're going to get it wrong sometimes. First time you teach a history class, or the first time you get a question from one of your students that you haven't thought of, you're going to feel like a trespasser or an alien. After you taught the class 4 or 5 times, you're going to feel at home. And you're bringing that home to them, I think, and making them feel that way. But they'll still ask a tricky question. So are you ready?
Yeah. And as you were saying earlier, for this yachtsman, it's about the journey. His role as a sailor almost makes him already a stranger to his home. So it's the discovery and a rediscovery of his home. Thank you. All right, in the logical course of things, I'm going to proceed to the beginning, or pedagogy, the art of teaching. And there's a lot here for the classical teacher, but I'd like to start by reminding you that it's important that history and literature not be viewed as mirrors. They're not simply reflecting ourselves and our personal experiences back at us. Although I know from my students that this is how history and literature are often taught at other places. We do not want to simply look for ourselves in what we read. Rather, history and literature are telescopes, directing us beyond our horizons. Or, if you're part of the mixed metaphor, pirate maps, directing us towards treasures. Most of us, at some point in our lives, have needed a guide to show us how to read the treasure map, or how to see the path, how to recognize what's in front of us. But before we can even get to that level of direction, before we can look for those skills that we need, we have to first want to travel that path. We have to have the desire to go forward and look for that end. And as teachers, that is our first challenge. We know that everyone learns so much better, so much faster when they are interested, when they are zealous about the topic. And oftentimes that zeal gets passed to their classmates and they spread infectious love of something. I once had a student who was obsessed with Legos, and by the end of the year, all of his classmates were also obsessed with Legos. That's the kind of zeal we want in our students for what they are studying. Which, by the way, what is the Latin word for zeal? Anyone know? Studium, which is where we get the English word study. Study in its right form springs from love. Study in the way it is meant to be comes from a desire to know more, to recognize more, to walk that path. In Dante's Divine Comedy, Dante the Pilgrim is traveling through the afterlife under the guidance of the Roman poet Virgil. Now, Dante at first, traveling through the Inferno, is driven by fear of all the horrors that he witnesses. And yet, as they move through, under the guidance of Virgil, Dante slowly begins to develop a love for what is good, for ultimately heaven. And as they pass down through the Inferno and up through Purgatory, Dante slowly begins to shift his motivation from driven by fear to drawn by love. And it is when he has that purified love that draws him forward that Virgil leaves and Dante can continue on that path without his guide. That is the arc that we want for our students. That is the growth that we are looking to inculcate in them. We are their Virgils, which is great for our egos until we're faced with a classroom of 25 little faces, all completely different needs, who are looking to us for complete direction, and we're like, what do we do? And this is where pedagogy comes in. There are two particular points about classical pedagogy, and they're both fairly simple. I bet you all know this already. But the first is engaging narrative. As Ms. Brown was talking about yesterday, this is part of the moral imagination. And it is incredibly important at all levels of education, from K through 12 up through college and grad school. And we have to stay with those stories because those are what we remember, what stays with us and forms us as we make decisions years later. And as teachers, we don't often see the growth of the seeds we plant. But these stories are the seeds. And the second step is formally called Socratic discussion, but it boils down to ask questions. Just ask questions as often as possible. Now, as we put this together, you're going to come up with many different methods and ideas and your own approach to this pedagogy, and that is wonderful. One of the great things about Founders is that we have the freedom to develop our own methods of pedagogy. We have that license and trust to work on our own methods. But as we work on it, it'll probably be a mixture of knowledge, organization, questioning, and drama. For history and literature, double the drama. The more dramatic, the better, no matter what age the students are. They eat it up and remember it, and it becomes part of them. I often act things out with my students, and I teach high school. They love acting out stories and putting things together. I remember when I was being homeschooled and my mom was teaching us about anatomy, She literally had us get up, move into the kitchen, and act out parts of the inner ear. And I remember the inner ear. I don't remember anything else about anatomy, but I remember that part. So the more we are dramatic, the more we have narratives, the better they will remember it. And the better it will influence them later on. Now, I had a whole spiel about this that I'm not going to go into because Ms. Brown did it perfectly yesterday. I can't add anything to that. But I will say that history, in particular, must be taught as a story. These days, it is often passed off as facts and dates, and those are important. But I can tell you the facts about something. 1803, President Thomas Jefferson sent forth an expeditionary corps to explore the West and the newly purchased territory of Louisiana. It lasted a year and a half. They discovered a multitude of plants and animals and established that, yes, there's more land. Why does that matter? How do we connect that to something that does matter? In fact, in the scope of historical cause and effect, did that change anything significant? Not really. Or, I could tell you the story of the nerdy secretary, Meriwether Lewis, who took crash courses in botany from the local, essentially, college in order to prepare for this mission. And his poorly educated but incredibly practical and organized army buddy, William Clark, who teamed up to lead the first exploration past the river. Their job, their official mission, was to discover the Northwest Passage, a river connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific in order to facilitate trade routes. There's no such passage. They failed in their prime directive, and yet they explored the first frontier. They went where no man had gone before. But what they did do was they established amicable relations with almost every native tribe. They charted or documented over 300 new species of animals and plants. They were the first white men to see the grizzly bear, the prairie dog, and what they named the jackass rabbit. And yet, they failed. There were moments when they had to fight against Mother Nature simply to survive. And only one of their corps died from appendicitis. How many leaders can say something like that? At one point on their trip back out east, they were climbing the mountain when they hit a wall of snow and realized that if they kept going, they would die. I'm going to come back to that in a second. But with that story, I'm not merely tying together cause and effect. Instead, this becomes a story of human effort, of courage, of prudence, determination. It becomes the epic road trip that they saw it as, and how it should be remembered. And if students only remember one act of virtue or strength, one point from that story, then that memory will stay with them and become admiration. Admiration becomes love. And what we love, we are. And that memory is a signpost in a way that the year 1803 never will be. It has to start with stories. They engage the imagination. And in our classroom, this can take the appearance of telling stories, of dramatic readings, of acting out the plays or the literature that we see. Every year, my 9th grade literature class reenacts the slaughter of the suitors in Odysseus' hall. They get to flip tables and throw erasers at each other and swear. Our book has swearing in it. And they love it. It's ridiculous. But they remember it. They will never forget that moment. And because of that, they will never forget the book. And if they remember that book and the struggles of one hero, one character, as he grows and changes, as he learns what he should value and love, then that is going to flower later on. Probably where I can't see it, but I trust that it will come to fruition. Now, the second part, then, as we get through the stories, is questioning. Because we have to step forward out of the stories and ask our students to make judgments. Judgments is a bad word these days, but it is important to education because we start with saying, well, what is it? Define our terms, move towards what's happening. Well, was that good or bad? We have to reach towards that judgment because it's not just stories of Odysseus or Lewis and Clark that will reach the students, but how do we judge them? Was William Clark a good leader? What did he do with his men? Was Odysseus a good leader? Was it his fault that literally none of his men made it back from the war? How do we judge them? And then that becomes, how do I lead? How do I start on this path? There are many different methods of Socratic discussion, and you will see lots of different ways of running seminars. I'm going to talk about one way later on, but it boils down to ask questions and listen to their answers. Because we can set up the questions in a scaffolded manner that leads them deeper. And if we don't get to the judgment part, then we're missing that formation of moral imagination. With younger kids, we start much more simply. What is the name of this character? What does this character do? Is this good or bad? And then we build on that foundation as we move. And in our classrooms, this is often read and discuss. Read and ask questions. Whenever you're having a really bad day and you can't think of how to run the classroom, it's really fun to ask really provocative questions. Just drop it and step back and let the students argue. And they get a lot out of it. But if we can spur those conversations, even if we don't have answers, sometimes best when we don't have answers, that starts moving the students towards that goal of independent thought, of the free soul. And that is also what engages them. That is what makes them love what they're doing, that discussion and that participation. Because that moves them towards that responsibility and personal ownership of their education. Now, I'm going to get into how to lay out some questions and then how to run Socratic circles. But first, let's take a moment and look at a historical document and how I would lay out a discussion of that document. So turn to handout number 2. Before you read it, I'm going to set up my scaffolding by asking you to define prudence without looking at a dictionary, without talking to anyone yet. What is the definition of prudence? What is prudence? Once you have your idea, discuss with your table, and then I'll go through and have you all tell us what your table's definition is.
Can practical wisdom take this information, evidence, inferences about people, places, things, and come up with reasonable courses of
10 seconds.
Honestly, I was considering this as like a decision of
All right, this table is done first, so I'm going to move this way, serpentine fashion. Can you tell us your definition of prudence, Ms. Burns?
The application of correct knowledge to reach wise and cautious decisions.
Okay, based on knowledge, to make good decisions or cautious. Ms. Nandamuni?
The ability to make wise decisions.
Okay. This table, any of you, I don't know your names, I'm sorry.
The guiding practice.
Yeah, I had more cautious, more wisdom. Maybe it's essentially like a.
Ms. Taylor and then Dr. Moore.
I was thinking kind of reserve before you do your action.
Yeah, look before you leave, think before you make decisions. Dr. Moore?
So I just want to say one thing, that Joseph Heber defines it as the perfected ability of making right decisions. What's a little embarrassing historically is that we had a president, I don't know if you remember, but George Bush, the first Bush, who said it wouldn't be prudent blasted by the press for making that statement. And so, as is suggested by your definitions, prudence is always seen on the side of caution. And that's the connotation it has, but really prudence should also be seen as a mark of courage if you're having to make a swift decision to take action. So prudence almost has a bad rap in our culture. It's unfair.
So there's a willingness to evaluate and take risks as necessary.
If you're a military leader, the prudent decision sometimes might be to attack first. So there's nothing inherently cautious about prudence, it's just that's the way that you use it.
Thank you.
I think in more modern history that saying someone is a prude and then that linked to prudence, and that's initially where I back here was even like that's kind of where I take prudence from, is that this ascension of where eventually it was caution, eventually it was, a manner of stepping back and going, is this right? But is that a problem of almost like a modern term being switched a bit, like as you say, they were, criticizing the president for using it in, where he used it in one term, they were taking it maybe in more of this one, modern variation. Not even prudence, but a prude, and that being like not willing to act.
I like that, and you bring up a good point, which is there are many different definitions and understandings. Some of them aren't even official definitions, but they're cultural understandings of certain words. And a lot of where miscommunication and trouble happens right now in our society is that we use words without defining them first. We have arguments without first setting our terms. And people could be arguing for the same idea, essentially, but because they hadn't set their terms, they don't know that they are. And it's one of the most heartbreaking reasons for a disagreement, when people just haven't determined their terms. And so that's where we start. What are our terms? And then how do we use that term to look at our literature, at our text, at what we're studying? So let's return to Lewis and Clark versus the mountain. This is a journal entry from William Clark in, what month is it? Does it say that? June. All right, Ms. Jackson, would you read?
1, define prudence by yourself. Oh, sorry. We collected our horses and set out early. We proceeded down Hungry Creek, about 7 miles, passing it twice. This mountain we ascended about 3 miles when we found ourselves enveloped in snow from 8 to 12 feet deep, even on the south side of the mountain. I was in front and could only pursue the direction
I
of
don't
the
know
road.
what word he means there. Misspelled. I have no clue what he's trying to say. He has a terrible spelling. It's not you.
Pursue. We're going to pursue the direction of the road by the trees which had been peeled by the natives for the inner bark of which they scraped and ate, as those peeled trees were only to be found scattered promiscuously. I, with great difficulty, browsed the direction of the road 1 mile further to the top of the mountain, where I found the snow from 12 to 15 feet deep. But the yew trees with the fairest exposure to the sun. Here was winter with all its rigors. The air was cold, my hands and feet were benumbed. We knew that it would require 4 days to reach the fish where at the entrance of Oak Creek. Short of that point, we could not hope for any food for our horses, not even under wood itself, as the whole was covered many feet deep in snow. If we proceeded and should get bewildered in those mountains, the certainty was that should lose all our horses and consequently our baggage, entrenchments, perhaps our papers, and thus eventually rest the loss of our discoveries which we had already made, if we should be so fortunate as to escape with life. Under these circumstances, we conceived it madness in this stage of the expedition to proceed without a guide who could certainly conduct us to the fishwares on the Kooskooskee, as our horses could not possibly sustain a journey of more than 4 or 5 days without food. We therefore come to the resolution to return with our horses while they were yet strong and in good order, and endeavor to keep them So until we could procure an Indian to conduct us over the snowy mountains, and again to proceed as soon as we could procure such a guide, knowing from the appearance of the snow that if we remained until it had dissolved sufficiently for us to follow the road, that we should not be able to return to the United States within this season. Having come to this resolution, we ordered the party to make a deposit of all the baggage which we had not immediate use for, and began our retrograde march. The party were a good deal dejected, though not as much so as I had apprehended they would have been.
All right. It's spelling.
Yeah, and I was like, is this me or is it him?
No, it is definitely him. Now, usually I would set this up and give my students one question at a time, because one leads into the other. In the interest of time, I'm going to give you the next 3 questions all at once so that you can proceed through them. We start with examining what's going on here. On what information was Clark making his decisions? Was he able to read the situation correctly? What did the choices he made reveal about his priorities? What did he actually value in this journey? And then combining those two, how do we judge him for this? Was William Clark a prudent or an imprudent leader? And I'll give you about 1.5 minutes before I start calling any Francis.
Whatever practical material
I know the experience. Maybe that experience which is why you can always change.
A little bit more prudent to realize that maybe if it's not such a priority, so if we could well, they currently
those are all really
because
what is the safest route to take to represent a significant
Cross country.
What would an imprudent leader have done in this context? Charge that's no. Just go do it. Tom Jefferson.
Take that.
Never served. From appendicitis. So that's like
15 seconds. All right, we're going to do the reverse serpentine order. Tell me what you and your table think about the last question. Is he prudent, recommended, and why?
Well, we think he was prudent because he weighed the risks, and he wanted to finish the journey, and he felt like he couldn't finish the journey this way, so he took this way. To possibly finish, he was taking a risk, but he thought it was a better risk somehow.
Back there? Anyone at that back table?
Similar to them, the horses and their safety, it was the whole expedition. If they lost those, they would lose everything. So he didn't take a risk.
Okay. This table, John Paul?
We said that given the circumstances, he made a prudent decision and that he gathered a lot himself, his mental sources, and then the information that he made up with all his discoveries and newspapers. So that was part of the mission to begin with. So until that end, he judged wisely.
Okay.
We felt that he was prudent, he valued life over the immediacy of returning.
you're all convinced that he is prudent, then I want to push at that so that your argument either becomes stronger as you think of reasons, or you start learning to think about it from the opposite side. So at this point I'd say, but why did you bring it in guys to begin with? What made him think he could make this journey to begin with? Why wasn't he prepared? Why didn't he look at another route? Why did he value the papers seemingly more than the lives of people? Because his first thought was we lose the papers. John Paul?
I guess I'm wondering, as the person that's directing the conversation with the teacher in this credit dialogue, are you trying to get them to see what you think is true about, for example, Lewis and Clark's decision? Like, do you want your students to see what's true, and so that it's the purpose of the conversation is to have them discuss and question and come to that conclusion themselves, but that's the motivation the entire time, to identify the reaction? Or is it more like playing devil's advocate so that they can refine their arguments, become more eloquent, but you're not trying to persuade them to see something that you think is true? I guess I'm just trying to
Yes.
work it out, because
Is my goal persuasion or simply poking at them?
yeah, well, well, the second one isn't just looking at them, I guess it'd be like helping them refine their arguments, which is great. But I'm just wondering what's, I guess in high school it's different from middle school, but what's persuasive, like pedagogically, telling versus directing them towards seeing it for themselves and giving them an opportunity to see it.
That is something that I skipped about Socratic dialogue, is that Socratic dialogue is famous for not providing answers. Socrates wanted the students to think through the problems and arrive at their own answers, because that way they understand it and they're more convinced. So we might have a particular truth that we are getting at when we start asking questions. And this might differ depending on grade level, so kindergartners need more scaffolding and a simpler direction than high schoolers, but we still are asking them to start thinking. So our goal is that they start thinking. And sometimes they might think the wrong thing, and in lower school, we might need to correct something. No, the R does not make the sound of the, but as we get into upper school and they have that solid foundation, we have to be patient with them as they're thinking through these paths. Because they can be convinced one day of one interpretation of the text, and then over the next few days start to learn and change their minds. So in upper school, it's nearly impossible just to lay out this as absolute in history and literature, other than historical facts, right? Or no, the text does not say that. But in terms of interpretation, we want to push them back and forth so they find a path, so that they start following those footsteps. Does that make sense? It's a combination of both. And the lower you are, the more you do need more direction. But as you get into upper school and at fifth grade level, I think they really can start being pushed and needled to think through it themselves. All right, the last part, the middle, as I'm going so logically. This is tools. Once we have the end goal and our own approach in the classroom, we have certain tools that are helpful for ourselves and our students. Now, there are many different kinds of tools and skills. Some that we just want our students to have in classical school, like eloquent prose writing. Sometimes we have state-mandated skills, like reading graphs and circling answers. Sometimes they have really practical skills that we want them to have, like cleaning off the lunch tables well. So there's a whole host of skills that we will teach in school. I'm going to focus on two skills in particular that are key to classical pedagogy, to this teaching method. The first is analytical reading, how to have scaffold analysis. And the second is a particular tool called Socratic discussions, which are the students have an independent discussion where I just sit there and listen and don't say a word. And I'm going to have to go through these fairly fast because I'm coming up on the end time, and I am sorry. First of all, Every teacher works better with reading if we can come up with a method of teaching our students how to scaffold their own thoughts and scaffolding for our own tests and quizzes and grading purposes. Having a structure in place helps us set up that classroom. And there are many different structures. As I said before, we have freedom to play with different methods of teaching reading analysis of anything we read. This is one that I have found to be particularly helpful. And it comes from philosopher Mortimer Adler's book, How to Read a Book. He literally wrote a book on reading a book. And he says a lot of great things in it. Most particularly starting with his end goal, which is reading is not a passive or merely receptive activity. It requires us to put effort and thought into it. And with that goal, he lays out 4 levels. Level 1, elementary reading, which is literally, can you read? Seems very simple, but this is an incredibly important step because without it, we have no foundation. And that really is one of the first places to start. Have students read out loud in your classroom to gauge their fluency and understanding. Number 2, narrative reading. What is happening? Who is doing what? What is the story? At this level, this is where we could fold in some of the other skills like plot arcs. How do we recognize setting, theme, character? But that would be folded in as part of this level of reading. 3, analytical reading. What does it mean? What is the motivation of characters? What are symbols? I actually really enjoy teaching this level because teaching about symbolism in literature is incredibly fun. And students start seeing it everywhere and you're like, yes, your boundaries just exploded. The last level is what Adler named synoptic reading. And at this level, this is where we connect the story or the text to the bigger picture. What do we learn from this? How does this echo other ideas? How does it connect to other characters, other books? How do we take something from this and apply it to our own lives? Depth, connection, consequences. And for an example, I'm going to take a passage from the Odyssey and walk through a very brief 4 levels of reading it. Ready? Telemachus spotted her first. He was sitting, nursing his heart's sorrow. Picturing in his mind his noble father returned and scattering the suitors, and that he himself, Telemachus, was respected at last. Then he saw Athena. He went straight to the porch, indignant that a guest had been made to wait for so long. Right. First level, can you read by a show of hands? Yay! Thank the nearest elementary teacher. I think that's you guys. Thank you. Narrative, what's happening? We aren't really looking at judgment at this point, just an understanding of what is going on. Telemachus is sulking and daydreaming, about taking his proper place. But then when he sees a guest, he instantly goes to take care of that guest. It does his job. This is the Greek virtue of hospitality, or xenia. Okay? Analytical, what are his motivations and what does this tell us about his character? Well, he was acting like a child. He's 20 years old. He was sulking like a child in the corner. And yet, as soon as he saw a need, as soon as he saw a lack of virtue, he put himself aside and went to fix the problem. He might still be a child, but he knew the right thing to do, and he did not hesitate to do it. Synoptic, we could unpack this for the entire hour, just this section. But to keep it brief, he was dreaming of glory and a parent to come rescue him with an easy fix. It should put you in mind of Achilles sulking on the beach until his mom comes to rescue him, sort of. And yet, unlike Achilles, Telemachus sees a problem and then steps outside of himself to fix it. He doesn't let his friends get killed in war because he's too busy sulking over his reputation. He instantly goes and does the most virtuous thing. level, these 4 levels, I use this first to scaffold my discussion questions with my students. So I have levels laid out for this, like my students. Level 1, you can read this. Level 2, what's going on? And then I start in on these questions. And we will go through this in class. For the first few months of school, we go over this very regularly so that they start thinking in this level. I also use this for quizzes and my quiz structure, as I set it up saying, reread this passage. It's something that we would usually have read in class or they had as homework. And then they will start answering questions along these levels. It makes it easier for me to grade, and that's always one of our goals, grade fast. But it also shows me what they are thinking and how they are thinking. So it lays out their thought processes, and it develops in them this habit of building down the scaffold. By the end of the year, my students are dipping in and out of the analytical and synoptic levels in our classroom discussions without stopping to think about it or name these different levels. So it's really developing that habit in them. Now, with lower school, they might not necessarily be able to reach the synoptic level at first, but they are building this foundation. And as they start to read narrative, as they repeat those stories back to you, you're building that structure for them to think more and more critically and deeply. We're going to come back to this quickly, but I want to get to Socratic circles, the second tool. Now, there are many different methods of Socratic seminars, and oftentimes in classical classrooms we will have discussions just as our primary mode of teaching, almost more so than lectures we have discussions. Socratic circles is a tool particular to helping students have their own discussions without our interference. So first of all, we start with giving them questions. I hold my seminars on Thursday or Friday, and on Monday of that week, I give my students 2 questions. These questions are particular to the text, but also open up bigger ideas. So for example, one of the first seminars I have every year is, does Achilles have free will? Or is he subject to fate? And they start in and realize pretty quickly they need to define what free will is. And that even after the discussion, they go out, even after the classroom of the seminar, they go out into the hallway still arguing with each other over whether or not they have free will. And they start thinking about these bigger ideas, springboarding from the text. Now, I have 2 questions per week, as I said earlier. On Tuesday, the students choose which question they're going to work on, and then they spend the rest of the week preparing their answers. They have to have 3 quotes that back up their answers, and they have to have questions about this that they can challenge their classmates in. So there are 2 groups of students. We come in the day of, and I set up the classroom with an inner circle and what we call an outer circle, although in my classroom it's more like wings. The inner circle goes first, they all sit down there. I set the timer, it starts off at 10 minutes, by the end of the year I get up to 15 or 18 minutes. And I just say, go, and set the timer. And they have to sit there and talk and challenge each other and work through these problems and make sure that they're working together to get everyone talking, because they get a bonus point if everyone agrees that's okay, right? So they start talking through these problems. Everyone else is silent, myself and the rest of the class. When the timer goes off, I say, all right, now peanut gallery, do you have comments and questions? And then the outer circle starts asking them questions, challenging them, nitpicking their logic, being sassy, and just trying to poke holes in their arguments. Teenagers love that. That's one of their favorite parts, when they challenge each other. And then they switch spots, and those in the outer circle go to the inner circle. And again, they have a timer set, and they go for the second question and just discuss it and take notes. And then again, the outer circle can challenge them. At the end of the timer, I give a few minutes, a few seconds, wrap up, a few words, or ask my own questions, and then they hand in their notes, and they leave, and it's done. So it's all about preparation, and then just sitting back and letting them do what they need to do to discuss. Now, Sometimes they're completely silent because they're still terrified, even though I'm not saying anything. So to help them have that structure, I give them a sentence stem so they can fill in if they're struggling with something. And it could be something simple like, I agree with so-and-so, because on page such and such it says this, which supports blah, 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 right? Or to try and keep their tone elevated and formal, I give an overly formal sentence which they love to use. The extra formality makes them feel important. I respectfully disagree with my learning colleague because such and such, as it says on such and such. But our goal throughout all of it is that the students learn to engage each other, to listen, to offer strong evidence, to speak eloquently, and have greater self-awareness and awareness of others. Now, I have a last passage, but we are completely out of time. I would encourage you to read it and read through those questions to see how I would set up that discussion. And I have my email up here. I really wish we could read that passage, but we're completely out of time. Do you guys have any questions? Dr. Moore?
One question, so you set it up at the end of the week, which I understand. You would have gone over those passages in the prior days, right?
Yes.
So how do you, because going over it in the way you're describing, so they know what's going on in the passages, first priority. How do you keep the debates from naturally breaking out in the earlier days of the duty? You see what I
To
mean?
some degree, we touch on those topics, but part of it is the scaffolding of the questions. Is in class discussion, I try to keep it more narrow to a certain passage or page, and we start discussions on those ideas. Oftentimes, I'll take the seminar questions from ideas that came up in class, but I make sure to phrase those questions so that they open up onto the bigger ideas. And I did not come up with Socratic circles. A friend of mine at Louisville introduced me to them. She implemented them really well in high school, but I've also seen this implemented in college and middle school, and I bet that it could be implemented as young as third grade, although that would take more work and more detailed questions and explanation of what is expected. But I think it can be dropped really well.
On the next that you grade, do you teach them, do you have a handout or anything that you could share that it'll give your instruction to help them put their ideas on paper?
I do, but my handout is not that thorough. It's mostly what I tell them in class. Because part of what we do in literature is we want to teach them to annotate and take their own notes. And as long as they have notes that make sense to them and help them think, that's still on it. But that's another reason why I have open book quizzes that go through the structures. They reread a passage from their book and then think. Is that in open book quizzes, they also have their own notes and annotation there, and it gives them the motivation to take better notes and to actually annotate. It's not an empty exercise anymore.
Do you give grades for this?
For seminar, yes, it's 50 points of a test grade.
And how do you break that up? How do you grade it?
20 points for their preparation notes, 10 points for their notes during the seminar, 10 points for their own self-graded section, where they have to grade themselves. Did I participate? Did I do this? Did I do this? And I have a list on that. And then 10 points in my commentary, which at the beginning of the year is, did you say two things, even if they weren't great? And then it gets more complicated throughout the year. If you have more questions, my email is up here, and I think we're being kicked out of the room.
No, seriously,